Hello, my fellow historians. Welcome back. I'm Aziz. With me is Ashea, and this is Valar Rereadis, episode 5 of A Game of Thrones. In the last episode, we discussed replacing the non-descriptive chapter titles, Dany 3, Bran 4. You know, after a time, those don't mean a lot. And, well, we have done so. Let's hit you with those to start off with. Today we're doing Daenerys 3, the one where Dany makes Viserys walk, aka the gang hits the Dothraki Sea.
Then Bran 4, the one with Old Nan's stories.
AKA the gang discusses Bran's saddle. Eddard 5, the one with Pycelle and the Ponderous Tome, AKA the gang listens to the ramblings of a shady maester. John 4.
Sorry, did you come up with new ones?
I have these. No, I'm looking at the Facebook list.
Oh.
That's where there's 2 of them each.
Yeah, I was looking in the document.
There's not as many in our episode
I'm
document.
not on Facebook right now.
Okay, well, John 4, the gang meets Sam, a.k.a. the one where John starts leading. Eddard 6, the gang meets Gendry, a.k.a. the one where Ned goes to the armorer. Catelyn 5, the one where she captures Tyrion, a.k.a. the gang hangs at the end of the Crossroads. And Sansa 2, the gang goes jousting, a.k.a. the one with Sandor's origin story. You guys can suggest chapter names for these in the future, so if you do so, either in Flick or in the Facebook group or on Patreon, we'll use the best ones and give you credit. So that should be fun, add a little humor to our episodes going forward. I'd say that the Dany and Bran chapters perhaps are the most standout this time. And they are pretty often, given the way this reread is focused, because those are 2 of the arcs that we're the most interested in, and we don't exactly know where they're going. Whereas, of course, with Cat, well, we don't know what the whole Stoneheart deal is, but Ned, we know where that's going. But still, even with these other chapters, I'm sure as a lot of you saw, you've already read them, there is a lot of amazing stuff in here, a lot of amazing foreshadowing, things that we didn't see before. And, well, let's get right to it. Daenerys 3. The Dothraki Sea, Sir Jorah Mormont said, as he reined to a halt beside her on the top of the ridge. That's the first line. In this one, Dany and the Khalasar cover a huge portion of the trip to Vaes Dothrak, and she adjusts to a lot of things, from her skin and muscles getting used to riding all day, getting used to being in the Khalasar, to the way Drogo treats her, even to her brother. But almost immediately after adjusting to these things, she starts to take command of them. Her leadership qualities really start to emerge. She rides out front. She doesn't command Drogo, but she does start to command respect from him, and certainly from other Dothraki, who she does command, and Jorah. Basically everyone around her, except for her brother. Read this quote.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I did not even... I was totally just reading the chat. Magister Illyrio had urged him to wait in Pentos, had offered him the hospitality of his manse, but Viserys would have none of it. He would stay with Drogo until the debt had been paid, until he had the crown he had been promised. And if he tries to cheat me, he will learn to his sorrow what it means to wake the dragon. Viserys had vowed, laying a hand on his borrowed sword. Illyrio had blinked at that and wished him good fortune.
It's yet another example of Viserys just saying something completely crazy. And earlier we took note that Dany took note of how Illyrio interacted with Viserys. In other words, that she notices that Illyrio doesn't take him fully seriously, which leads us to what we now know, that he was always a smokescreen, sort of a diversion. And then this point, though, I wonder if Illyrio is even worried. Before he kind of grinned or had a secret smile that only Dany saw at Viserys being so nutty. But maybe at this point he's starting to think, this guy's even nuttier than we planned for. The plan to have him invade the Seven Kingdoms, it's not going to work if he's such a weak, raging fool that he can't even live long enough to do that. Varys and Illyrio may have expected madness to manifest in him as it did in Aerys, but as it did in Aerys, it was slower. And of course, in Aerys' time, when he was younger, he was almost promising. Maybe not quite promising, but he seemed like a decent dude until things started to go bad. Perhaps they thought the Targaryen coin flip might land in their favor with Viserys, At least they thought maybe it would take longer for him to go nuts, but it didn't. It didn't take long at all, maybe because he was already that way when he was born. Dany might be the only one in the entire Khalasar who respects Viserys, and that ends probably this chapter, or at least it starts happening this chapter. Feelings she's wrestled with, suspicions that she's had, that she notices that no one else is scared of him. It's only me. And she starts to put all that together. She's intelligent, and Jorah gives her a little help moving those thoughts along here.
Jorah pulled up his horse and looked at her. Truth now. Would you want to see Viserys sit in a throne? Dany thought about that. He would not be a very good king, would he? There have been worse, but not many.
Yeah, one would be Aerys, her father, whom even Jorah didn't serve, as he was still a Stark bannerman then. Before, I thought this plotting was somewhat standard, as in, well, she'll be the opposite, right? That's early on. I thought Dany won't go mad, but now, well, she may end up being perceived by many as the Mad Queen, whether she actually has a full descent into madness or not. The perception is going to be a big part of it, and the truth will be something else. Those will be two different things we'll have to wrestle with. And so will she. And we'll see about all that when the time comes. Certainly no one's going to compare her to Viserys, because Viserys is largely forgotten. There's not going to be a lot of people who know what he was like. So maybe she'll be compared to her father, but not to her brother. Although maybe she'll be compared to her other brother, Rhaegar, who people did know pretty well.
Think about how much it would piss Viserys off to know he was nothing but a footnote in history.
When they write the reign of your sweet reign, my sister, oh, my sweet reign, I said that all wrong. Anyway, good point. So we pointed out that in the last chapter of Dany's that there were lots of threes, and that of course builds up to her child of three theme that comes later. Now here there's a little bit of that as well, but maybe one of the specific ones, the mounts to ride, comes up here a lot. One to bed, one to dread, and speaking of Rhaegar's son, one to love. She has already taken the one to bed, that's Drogo, and Drogon is the one to dread. This is like a bridge to him. Her silver horse is the confidence that she feels. It gives her power that she hadn't felt before. It gives her freedom, and that's all going to pale in comparison to how riding a dragon's going to feel. But you can see the similar language.
The descent was steep and rocky, but Dany rode fearlessly, and the joy and danger of it were a song in her heart. All her life, Viserys had told her she was a princess, but not until she rode her silver had Daenerys Targaryen ever felt like one.
Yeah. And interpreted with her love of her silver are more dragon dreams, or rather interspersed with her love of her silver are more dragon dreams. Excuse me. The egg feels warm to her even when she's awake, meaning it's not just something that happens in her dreams. And she notes how similar the dream dragon's coloring is, it's black, to the egg that becomes Drogon. And this gives her strength. It feels to her like rebirth. But it's also foreboding, given what we know. Check this out.
She could hear it singing to her. She opened her arms to the fire, embraced it, let it swallow her whole, let it cleanse her and temper her and scour her clean. She could feel her flesh sear and blacken and slough away, could feel her blood boil and turn to steam, and yet there was no pain. She felt strong and new and fierce.
Yeah, at the time, and the way it's written, it seems like rebirth. And it is. It is in a lot of that. But it also has that tinge, if not more than a tinge, of madness. I mean, this is the build-up to what becomes voices telling her to jump into the fire. That's a decidedly not sane thought. Or, I mean, just having voices telling you to jump into a fire that's not good. It's just that in her case, it worked. Her father thought burning himself would result in his rebirth in a dragon. She's had other ancestors that had similar dreams. In their case, it didn't work. But in her case, it's gonna. And, well, how do you figure? If something seems all insane like that, but it actually works, how do you judge that? I don't know. And Aerys was wrong, right? He didn't exactly get a chance to do the things she did, but it doesn't exactly argue for you to stop listening to the voices in your head when they turn out to be right, you know? Like if the voices are telling you to do crazy things, like, I need to stop listening to those voices. These voices have led her to, power, at least. And along with the notion that there's life in the eggs, well, it's even more than that, because the chapter ends with us learning that she's pregnant with Rhaego, and she sees this as all this prophecy. What little bit she's been exposed to so far is for him, but we know better. It's for her.
Real quick, regarding that quote that I just read, I think that it's really an example of the beautiful writing that there is, and it relates to the whole, theme of 3 that we were talking about, because it's cleanse her and temper her and scour her.
Oh, yeah.
Sear and blacken and slough.
Those are in 3s.
Strong and new and fierce.
Oh, wow. Good catch. That's 3 3s just right there in that quote. I didn't see that.
Not all of them are 3s, but it's just like a very... it's beautiful. Anyways.
It is. It's beautiful and deadly and strange and really cool.
You didn't need the 4th. Stick with 3.
Oops.
Rule of 3.
I'm ruining it. I'm ruining it.
It's true in comedy. It's true here.
Sansa would be yelling at me for ruining it right now. Let's talk about some world building. There is some fantastic world building in this chapter. This chapter really has it all. This is why one of the reasons why I think it's maybe the most important of the 7 here, but your mileage may vary whether it's most important or not. It's damn important.
They crossed the rolling hills of Norvos, past terraced farms and small villages where the townsfolk watched anxiously from atop white stucco walls. They forded 3 wide, placid rivers, and a 4th that was swift and narrow and treacherous, camped beside a high blue waterfall, skirted the tumbled ruins of a vast dead city where ghosts were said to moan about among blackened marble columns.
A 4th river? Why didn't he make it 3 rivers? Damn it, he ruined it. He ruined it. So as Dany tours, so do we. These little bits of world building are like caffeine. The first time through the books, there's just too much to take in. I'm too busy thinking about the plot and who these characters are and all this. There's richness worthy of all the many colors of grass in the Dothraki Sea here, though. And, you can't piece it all together when you don't have all this context. But now, every little bit of that description we can say something about. Those blackened marble columns in a vast dead city near rivers, that's a dead giveaway that this was a Rhoynar city, as we detailed in our Nymeria series. I mean, you got the blackened columns, that's blackened by dragonfire. And indeed, east of Pentos is the Little Rhoyne, the Upper Rhoyne, the Coin, the Darkwash. These are some of the rivers, if not all of them, that they've just passed over. And take a look at, the map. Michael Klarfeld's version of Essos is perfect. If you're watching live, it's right here. It shows these features. You can see those rivers really well. And along with other features, such as what's in this next quote here.
They raced down Valyrian roads 1,000 years old and straight as a Dothraki arrow. For half a moon they rode through the forest of Qohor, where the leaves made a golden canopy high above them, and the trunks of the trees were as wide as city gates. There were great elk in that wood, and spotted tigers, and lemurs with silver fur and huge purple eyes, but all fled before the approach of the Khalasar, and Dany got no glimpse of them.
So cool. The first of all, the Valyrian roads, we'll see those again. Tyrion
and the little lemurs, the little Valyrians.
They're so cool. I love those guys. I forgot that those were mentioned this early.
Yeah, I know. I think they're so cool.
When they were mentioned in the World of Ice and Fire, I was like, oh, that's cool. That's a cool little thing they added. I had forgotten that they were actually in A Game of Thrones. So we'll take a closer look at the Valyrian roads. When Tyrion takes a close look at them, he actually thinks about how they're made and things like that. So that's many books away, but I don't know that the roads are something that we need to discuss now. So we'll try to be as efficient as we can. But yeah,
I don't think we heard about those lemurs at any point after A Game of Thrones until the World of Ice and Fire, which is a long time later. Yeah. 18 years after Game of Thrones, George was still like, those lemurs.
Let me tie that together. Let me go ahead and close that circle for you.
Or it's possible that Elio and Linda were like, I wonder what those lemurs, and they asked him. I'm just
that
curious.
Might be it, because that is apparently one of the things they did was go through and look for little world building notes to ask George to expand on.
So it could be that kind of situation.
Maybe Linda and Elio are the ones to thank for closing that circle. So yeah, the World of Ice and Fire called them Little Valyrians, which makes sense. They're silver-haired and purple-eyed, and not only are they unusual in their coloring, but we learn that there's lemurs elsewhere in the world, but they're all really far south. So Thorios and the Summer Isles are the only place we hear of them. So super far away than the forest of Qohor, and separated by vast seas, in addition to being continents away. So, well, here's where we get really deep. And this is great because we love to talk about, and George loves to talk about, how one sentence in one of his books can lead to so much discussion. Here we go. In our Gagasos episode, which is a patrons-only episode, we talk about the Valyrians and their so-called flesh pits and blood magic experimentations and all the rumors and facts that we have about engineered species. And that this is even more odd. I mean, all that stuff is even more odd than these lemurs, but it might be related. This might mean the lemurs were a product of the Valyrian blood magic. Maybe some Valyrian blood magician was like, hey, I want to, they just showing off their ability to show magic. George has done this before in other series where people get so advanced that they show off with their technology. It's in Dying of the Light is a good example of that. First novel he ever wrote. Not first story, first full-length novel. And so that's, first time I read this book, I didn't take note of those lemurs. Like I said, there were so many other things to think about, like Daenerys and the Dothraki, things that were a little more prominent. This time, like I said, that sentence led us to blood magic, griffins, dragons, the Targaryens with their literal blood, and how that explains resistance to heat and disease, and how that goes to dragon riding. And here we are back to also the madness, perhaps. That might be where some of that comes from. Now, it's normal in, because of human genetics, real world genetics, blaming incest for Targaryen madness. But George loves these double meanings, these multiple meanings, these confounding factors. It could be both. Dragon blood and incest could be the factors in madness. We don't know. So all that from lemurs named after a dead, doomed nation, we'll say, right? And the little Valyrians might die out too, but their doom is more likely to be ice and winter, not fire and magma, right? Because they're so far in the north. If the long night descends and you can see where the Forest of Qohor is, it's to the north of the continent. So if winter strikes Westeros, it could easily strike Essos as well, and that would be the first part of the continent impacted. And that ties us back to this chapter because we have so much life that is present in that forest, as we've seen here, but we also have so much life on the Dothraki Sea, all the many colors of grass that's described, all the animals that live there as well. So if winter and or darkness comes to the Dothraki Sea, all that grass just becomes nothing.
Past here, there were no hills, no mountains, no trees, nor cities, nor roads. Only the endless grasses, the tall blades rippling like waves when the winds blew. It's so green, she said. Here and now, Sir Jorah agreed. You ought to see it when it blooms, all dark red flowers from horizon to horizon like a sea of blood. Come the dry season, and the world turns the color of old bronze.
So yeah, what will it look like if it all dies? Like I said, I think it's just going to look like desolation. Just there'll be nothing with it. Like it said, there's no cities, no roads, it's just grass. And if all the grass is gone, then there's truly nothing. What about ghost grass? Ghost grass also makes we get to talk about that. It's a strange concept. I really don't get what the deal is with ghost grass and how it relates to the long night and just what it is in general. It's a really interesting remaining mystery. Maybe it's going to be part of the desolation. Maybe, who knows? We'll see. So in general, this suggestion of doom and desolation is hanging over this chapter. And it's not all pointed at the Dothraki Sea, though, is it? It's there's a whopper of a line here that right after she starts associating home with King's Landing, and it gets dark.
It was King's Landing and the great red keep that Aegon the Conqueror had built. It was Dragonstone where she had been born. In her mind's eye, they burned with 1,000 lights, a fire blazing in every window. In her mind's eye, all the doors were red.
A fire blazing in every window. Think about that for King's Landing. Oh, a flyer. Yes, a flyer blazing in every window. A flyer fly? A flyer fly? And some more amazing writing right around the same spot here. This metaphor about power and privilege is really strong here.
She rode at the head of the Khalasar with Drogo and his blood riders, so she came to each country fresh and unspoiled. Behind them, the great horde might tear the earth and muddy the rivers and send up clouds of choking dust, but the fields ahead of them were always green and verdant.
Yeah, it's true that people often don't see the damage that they cause, especially when you sit at the top of a power structure like this. To see it, you have to look back. And, well, Dany, she can't look back, because if she looks back, she's lost. There's some comparisons to be drawn between Dany's early marriage to Drogo and Cersei's early marriage to Robert. Robert would also ignore Cersei all day, would go out drinking and hang out with his friends, and then just kind of come back at night to, sleep with her and be very rough about it. And so they both kind of had to deal with that in their own way. Not an easy topic, but the parallel's definitely there. And all this power, there's lots of questions of what power looks like in here. With Dany is questioning, her own brother, and Ser Jorah's kind of giving her these leading questions. Much later, we have Varys asking similar questions, like what does power look like? What is it? Melisandre brings up questions like this as well, and Jorah himself points out some of the dichotomies here, and he himself is realizing that of the two of them, who is the more capable, right?
She barefoot with dirt between her toes and oil in her hair. He with his silks and steel.
Yeah, but he sees through it. Dany is immersing herself in Dothraki culture and clothing, but that is empowering her, saving her, and Viserys is refusing to adapt. It's like the old adage of nature: adapt, evolve, or die. And he is not evolving, and he will die. So there you go. There's also a little overlap of Ned's way of ruling here that we spoke about last time. Dothraki leaders might ride at the front, but they're always visible out in the open, kind of doing what their subjects do, but kind of in the alpha version of it, I suppose you could say. As with Ned's thinking on dining with different guests to try to bind, them all together. The Khalasar is kind of run in a similar way, a roughly similar way, the way that Drogo is always with his men, and it's not just loyalty, but there's an element of friendship there and camaraderie. But of course, it's very exclusive. They all get to see everything. They talk about how they even have sex out in the open, things like that. And this is a really interesting comparison to the Baratheon rule. Robert, Joffrey, Tommen. There, the distinction is shown that, especially someone like Cersei, who doesn't hardly ever leave the Red Keep. They're isolated from their subjects. Especially someone like Joffrey, who really doesn't get it. Even Catelyn in this chapter we're covering here, there's a lot of things she just doesn't really quite grasp about being a commoner, and it's an important recurring theme. All right, so a couple of questions here as we end Dany 3. Sorav wants to know, did Quaithe send the dragon dreams to Dany? That's a good question. The origin of the dragon dreams is definitely something to be considered. I would guess no, though, that they weren't sent by Quaithe, because there's been so many dragon dreamers amongst the Targaryens over so many centuries, and I wouldn't guess that Quaithe has just been around sending them all these years.
Yep, she has.
Yep, okay, you heard it here first.
It is known.
And it's there's possibly the other Targaryens got dreams sent from somewhere else, but that seems like a stretch, that there's just some force out there constantly sending dreams to Targaryens. So I would think no. I think it's in something with the blood, and maybe there's some magical energy that they're receiving, like satellite dishes can pick up on radio signals, that kind of thing. But yeah, I would guess that's not quite there, but I am wondering, but that doesn't mean Quaithe isn't sending other things to her. And once we get to Quaithe, we'll have more to say about that. John Hagee says, I guess because the horses are also food, they don't get names. Good point. Dothraki don't name their horses, and yeah, so often they eat them. That makes a lot of sense. That's a good call. Amy Lantrip says that's a good point. They're important to the Dothraki, but not humanized. Yeah, that is also true, and it's really fun us going through here and looking for details like that. I pointed out last time how Drogo almost treats Dany like a horse. He's kind to her until she loses her fear, and then he goes back to treating her kind of like a broken-in animal. And that's not good. But it is what it is, and let's move forward. Bran 4, the one with Old Nan stories. We meet her, we meet Hodor, and we hear stories of them both and of things much older and colder. Everything moves around him, and he doesn't feel as though he's a part of it, which is foreshadowing for his detachment later. Tyrion, who understands being left out, shows up and helps him feel included again, and makes yet another Stark friend. He's starting to be good at that, huh?
In the yard below, Rickon ran with the wolves.
Indeed, he did. This line, the first of the chapter, makes me think of the pack surviving while the lone wolf dies. But again, Bran won't die in the physical sense, but he may die in the sense that he's not really Bran anymore. There's a lot of kind of dichotomy you keep using that word over and over of him losing his Starkness yet becoming more of a Stark in certain ways. And the old god symbolism remains really strong here as we go from dire wolves to crows, then his coma dreams, and now talking to old Nan.
It was just a lie, he said bitterly, remembering the crow from his dream. I can't fly. I can't even run. Crows are all liars, old Nan agreed.
So must mean that old Nan was told. The Bran talked about his dream for her to, he says it was just a lie, and she knows, kind of has a sense of what he was talking about.
I think she slept with a Night's Watchman. Crows are all liars. It was just went right over his head.
But I do wonder about that line. Like, that's kind of a peculiar line. Crows are all liars. A lot of people have used that to indicate that maybe Bloodraven is misleading Bran somehow, which I do think he is misleading Bran. I don't think he's misleading him for a truly dark ulterior motive, but I do think he's misleading him in part because of his nature, meaning not Bloodraven's nature, but Bran has a very merciful, loving nature, and I don't think he would be willing to do some of the things that are quote unquote necessary from Bloodraven's perspective, not necessarily from our perspective or my perspective. So I think this touches on that a bit.
This Hodor quote?
Yeah, Hodor's introduced on screen, and we get a very sly way of doing it.
No one knew where Hodor had come from, she said, but when he started saying it, they started calling him by it. It was the only word he had.
No one knew where Hodor had come from. Yep. Well, now we all know. Mm-hmm. Hold the door. We know that's what it means now. But
it starts with
the way he's introduced is so funny now, huh?
The door opened with a bang, and Bran's heart leapt up into his mouth in sudden fear. But it was only Maester Luwin, with Hodor looming in the stairway behind him.
That's so funny. I love it. Banging the door open. Hodor was nearly 7 feet tall, right? Here's another quote from Ashea.
Hodor was nearly 7 feet tall. It was hard to believe that he was the same blood as old Nan. Bran wondered if he would shrivel up as small as his great-grandmother when he was old. It did not seem likely, even if Hodor lived to be 1,000.
Lived to be 1,000? That made me think about that for a second. But Bran's vision into Dance with Dragons shows us what could be, or probably is, young Nan kissing what is very likely Duncan the Tall, which at the time seemed to confirm the long-held theory that Sir Duncan the Tall is the ancestor of Hodor. We haven't seen anything to challenge that. That is still the operating theory that we're working off of. Hodor's only known kin here is old Nan. Only known kin from her branch of the family, given what I just said. We're clearly supposed to think about this. She's named in several other chapters before appearing on screen, and she continues to be named in a lot of other chapters she doesn't appear in.
She was the oldest person in Winterfell for certain, maybe the oldest person in the Seven Kingdoms. Nan had come to the castle as a wet nurse for a Brandon Stark whose mother had died birthing him. Of course. He had been an older brother of Lord Rickard, Bran's grandfather, or perhaps a younger brother or a brother to Lord Rickard's father.
So only one of these suggestions actually fits the family tree that we're given in the World of Ice and Fire, and it's the last one. The Brandon young Nan came to Winterfell to be a wet nurse for was a brother to Lord Rickard's father. Lord Rickard's father was Lord Edwyle, and he had a half-brother born before him whose mother died. So that fits all the little details of that story. And that it also fits the idea that she died in childbed because, Lord Edwyle had a half-brother, and so that all works. So this Brandon also clearly did not live a long life, which is why Edwyle, Bran's great-grandfather, inherited Winterfell when their father, Lord Willem, was slain by wildlings at the Battle of Long Lake some 72 years before this scene. As for his thought that she's the oldest person in the Seven Kingdoms, well, Melisandre probably has her beat, though she hasn't been in Westeros very long by this point. Walder Frey and Aemon are two other very old ones, while the ghost of Highheart and Bloodraven, well, depending on whether you still classify them as persons, if you don't think Bloodraven counts as a person, then, well, you might have to say Bran won't eventually either. That's too bad. Old Nan came to wet nurse for a Brandon, and she goes right for a story about a Brandon from long ago.
I could tell you the story about Brandon the Builder, old Nan said. That was always your favorite. Thousands and thousands of years ago, Brandon the Builder had raised Winterfell, and some said the Wall. Bran knew the story, but it had never been his favorite. Maybe one of the other Brandons had liked that story. Sometimes Nan would talk to him as if he were her Brandon, the baby she had nursed all those years ago, and sometimes she confused him with his uncle Brandon, who was killed by the Mad King before Bran was even born. She had lived so long, Mother had told him once, that all the Brandon Starks had become one person in her head.
Well, if that isn't Werewood foreshadowing or the Werewood network in a nutshell, then, well, I don't know what is. That's seeing all these Brandons throughout history will be something that Bran himself can be doing a few books from now. And the association of her accumulated wisdom, well, the Werewood net's been doing that for a lot longer. It's a similar kind of concept. George weaves his story such that Old Nan is weaving stories that resonate with her own story. It's stories upon stories upon stories. How many stories are we dealing with at once? Well, the reader lives 1,000 lives, so 1,000? I don't know, a lot. Her stories continue to resonate throughout the POV characters' memories, too. In particular, Bran and Arya think of her several more times in their chapters, even in Feast and Dance. And Jon thinks of her as well. Even Theon thinks of her. They may think of her with increasing frequency in latter books as more of her stories continue to come alive. As the more they come real, then the more people are going to be like, whoa, Old Nan was telling the truth, I guess. Damn. She tells a wide variety of these stories to the various young characters in Winterfell who have lived there over the years, whether they're young now or not. But this is the one time we get it up close and personal.
In that darkness, the others came for the first time, she said as her needles went click, click, click. They were cold things, dead things, that hated iron and fire and the touch of the sun, and every creature with hot blood in its veins. They swept over holdfasts and cities and kingdoms, felled heroes and armies by the score, riding their pale dead horses and leading hosts of the slain. All the swords of men could not stay their advance, and even maidens and suckling babes found no pity in them. They hunted the maids through frozen forests and fed their dead servants on the flesh of human children.
So now when we consider the others, we're armed with the knowledge that they are likely a creation of the children, made to fight back against the first men who were overwhelming them. Iron and fire were two of the first men's biggest weapons, so it makes sense that the others, creatures of cold and darkness, have certain vulnerabilities to heat and sun, and forged metals too, but maybe not iron, but Valyrian steel and other things like that. These traits also describe the children. They live in dark caves, and they don't make forged weapons, and they stay away from the sun, and there's a lot in common there. They live in the darkness of those caves, etc. So
now these were the days before the Andals came, and long before the women fled across the narrow sea from the cities of the Rhoyne, and the 100 kingdoms of those times were the kingdoms of the first men, who had taken these lands from the children of the forest. Yet here and there in the fastness of the woods, the children still lived in their wooden cities and hollow hills, and the faces in the trees kept watch.
Nice reminder of how many of these seeds were planted or even partly grown so early in the story, and that I love the reference to things like the wooden cities and hollow hills. Well, we haven't seen evidence of the wooden cities, but the hollow hills, that's exactly what the spot where the Brotherhood Without Banner sets up, with Beric sitting on a weirwood throne looking all like Bloodraven with his one eye and black cloak and bony, visage and all that.
So as cold and death filled the earth, the last hero determined to seek out the children, in the hopes that their ancient magics could win back what the armies of men had lost. He set out into the dead lands with a sword, a horse, a dog, and a dozen companions. For years he searched, until he despaired of ever finding the children of the forest in their secret cities. One by one his friends died, and his horse, and finally even his dog, and his sword froze so hard the blade snapped when he tried to use it.
Yeah, I wonder about the snapping. Blades snapping isn't usually how that's described. Ned does describe snapping needle over his leg, but that's not usually how blades are described as breaking. And so I wonder if he's kind of describing this parts of this story that sound like Jon and parts of it that sound like Bran. And, well, secret cities, we kind of maybe have seen some of that. Like I talked about, the sword, the horse, the dog. I mean, the dog could be one of the direwolves. The horse, I don't know where that comes from. Neither, I don't know if Jon's going to ride a horse north. Bran doesn't do much riding after his saddle. He doesn't take his special saddle north with him. So some of these details don't quite line up, but we know this it's still too strong of a message about the last hero for us to ignore it, or for us to think that it's faux shadowing. It's definitely not faux shadowing, but I think maybe some of these details are a little different than maybe the way it's come forward now. But we can write that off as just, this is a thousands of year old story that has changed over time. The details shift a little bit. And but there's more to it than this. The quote continues.
And the others smelled the hot blood in him and came silent on his trail, stalking him with packs of pale white spiders, big as hounds.
Big as hounds, you say. One of the favorite quotes from the early book here, early Game of Thrones. Lovely quote. But that's something we never saw. We didn't see that on TV, unless it's a metaphor we somehow didn't grasp, but I doubt that. And so that's something to look forward to, right? Yeah. Pale white spiders, as big as hounds. Packs of them, not just a couple.
I don't necessarily look forward to that, I have to say.
But here's an interesting thing. They smelled the hot blood in him. Can the undead smell cold hands, or undead Jon, or even Melisandre, Firewhite stuff? I don't know about that. That's interesting. You wonder if that will... It's been a theory that Jon's undeath will allow him to face the extreme cold. Like he can go north because he's no longer human and he won't freeze to death. Well, this fits in with that concept. If he no longer has hot blood in him, then, well, we could be onto something with that.
My stories? No, my little lord, not mine. The stories are, before me and after me, before you, too.
That is such a meta line, isn't it? I mean, that is so true. In the real world, stories are. They are. Whether they're true, whether they're, they don't belong to people, they're just... Our stories affect human life. We do live by them in many ways, and a lot of truth in that one. At the end of this chapter, Yoren reminds us that the stories aren't necessarily coming true. In a sense, they've always been true. It's a different way to look at it.
Down here might be that's true, Maester, Yoren said. But up past the wall, who's to say? Up there, a man can't always tell what's alive and what's dead.
Now, in this conversation, they're talking about the children of the forest dying out. But of course, what's alive and what's dead has a lot of other meanings. The others, the whites, cold hands, Jon Snow again. So a lot of talk of undeath and the nature of the evil menace is being said here. And indeed, he's right, though. It can be hard to tell what's alive and what's dead, and in what form. Is it completely dead, half dead? Yeah, a lot more of that to come. So let's talk about some more faux shadowing in this chapter, because there is a good bit.
You Starks are hard to kill.
Yeah, Jon says that to Robb in an earlier chapter, and here Tyrion says it to him. So that line comes up twice. The thing about being hard to kill, though, is it implies people want to kill you, and that obviously does catch up with Robb eventually. He was hard to kill, but, it did happen eventually. Robb is also sitting on the Stark high seat with his sword across his lap, which it's meant to show that Tyrion is unwelcome. It's a gesture of, you're not welcome here, which even Bran understands. But it's also the exact posture taken by the dead Stone Kings down in the crypts. Robb is assuming the position that he will find himself in 2 more books once he's killed. Sad. The subject of Benjen, another hard-to-kill individual, is raised again. Pun intended. And Robb yells out that he's not dead. Well, that might be a matter of philosophy there, Robb. Undead, not dead. What does that mean? Assuming he's even undead. The show surely cut corners on the Benjen plot line, but...
All Bran could think of was old Nan's story of the others and the last hero, hounded through the White Woods by dead men and spiders big as hounds.
Spiders big as hounds.
He was afraid for a moment until he remembered how that story ended. The children will help him, he blurted. The children of the forest.
Well, HBO did at least go that route. Not the spiders as big as hounds, damn it. But the children will help him part. The children did help him. It was very shallowly explained. It was like 2 lines of dialogue. Dragon glass, yada, yada. That was what they said, But...
That is what they said.
Yeah, Benjen was like, oh, yada, yada, dragon glass. Y'all, don't worry about it. It works. So I imagine we're going to get a little more detail. Maybe a lot more detail. The mechanism will be a little more complicated. But so that's something to look forward to. I'm not actually throwing shade at the show for not going into more detail there. I kind of like that we get that mystery left for us for later. Another relevant mechanism, speaking of magical mechanisms, this one's not magical, although it's going to be, it's foreshadowing for use on a magical beast, and that is the saddle. This has long been seen as foreshadowing for Tyrion to design dragon saddles, meaning this bit for Bran. If that doesn't happen, the only other way they could do saddles is to maybe, some old books that have Valyrian's dragon saddle design in them. I don't know. But I think Tyrion is much more likely to be the guess for that. And on the human level here, moving aside the magic, this is just a great gesture. This is a legitimate, real gesture of compassion. And from Tyrion's POV later, there's never any hint that this was ulterior motive. He's not like, I'm going to befriend those Starks so I can get them. It's legitimate. He's just being friendly. The North remembers, and Bran will remember, just like Jon will. All these characters, even Robb will remember that Tyrion has befriended Starks. He doesn't win Robb over, but this hostility that he was showing Tyrion melts away into this kind of mix of gratitude and shame and confusion. Really, it leads to a scene that feels a bit incongruous. Really, normally the direwolves match their owners' moods, right? That's very typical. It's even true for real dogs. But after relaxing, you would think that Grey Wind would relax too. Bran feels grateful internally, and Summer would feel that. Rickon's always the wild card, but still, all three of the direwolves menace Tyrion. So, if you're puzzled by that, as Robb was, well, I do believe it's definitely foreshadowing. The 1993 outline called for Tyrion to eventually besiege and burn Winterfell. So, this is them being mad at him in advance, I guess. Of course, that does still happen, but it's not Tyrion who does that. So, I suggest being on the lookout for hints that it'll be Ramsay Snow. We know that's going to happen, but maybe there's some hints foreshadowing before that we didn't catch the last time around. And of course, Ramsay doesn't actually besiege Winterfell. He uses guile. That said, we still expect a siege at Winterfell, but it's not the one we saw on TV. I think it'll be, and a lot of people agree with this theory, that it's going to be Stannis besieged at Winterfell by the dead after he defeats some of or all of the Boltons. And if it's not him, then, well, someone's getting besieged at Winterfell by the dead. I'm pretty sure. I'd bet on that one. Interestingly, Shaggy's black fur and green eyes are mentioned, and Bran notes Tyrion's one green and one black eye. I don't really see a connection here. Shaggy's eyes are said to be like green fire, and Tyrion does make use of wildfire later, but that feels just like a coincidence to me. However, it is interesting, the green fire of Shaggy's eyes that comes up a few times, and I never really know what that meant other than it being really evocative and descriptive. But here's another quote to consider.
Mother will be home soon. Maybe we can ride out to meet her when she comes. Wouldn't that surprise her to see you a horse? Even in the dark room, Bran could feel his brother's smile. And afterward, we'll ride north to see the wall. We won't even tell Jon we're coming. We'll just be there one day, you and me. It will be an adventure.
Now, unlike some of the other foreshadowing that leads you astray, this one just seems like innocent hopes, but it is foreshadowing. Recall that the story originally did indeed have Catelyn, Bran, and Arya flee north to the wall after the war between the Starks and Lannisters goes badly. And then they flee beyond that even. But even in the original plan, Robb was not going to get that far. Robb was going to die in battle in the original plan. Instead, he's killed outside of battle, but either way, it's, in terms of this part of the story, this piece of foreshadowing, it ends up being about the same. Joe Buckley notes that he's reading Storm of Swords at the moment, and he reread this Bran chapter the same day, and it has Hoster's death where he's at. And Robb is in full-blown king mode by then, which is an interesting comparison to him, still struggling to deal with it early on here. And it's not really that big a difference, though, in terms of his age and disposition. It's just the world forces him to grow up really quickly. And just like Sansa lost her Starkness when she lost Lady, at the beginning of this chapter, we talked about how Bran is losing some of that too. He can't play with the wolves. He still has a wolf. So it's there, but he's detached in an interesting way. So it's a subtle way of him losing his Starkness while still being among the Starks. Pretty clever. And interestingly, it's Tyrion who has a huge part in pulling Bran back into the real world, that in showing him how he can still be a part of it in ways. after it was Jaime who tried to push him out of it. Nice little bit of irony detected by Joe Buckley there. A couple of questions from Bran 4 before we move on to the next one. Old Nan not only tells great stories in Westeros, but she gave the real world a phrase with which to throw shade. So any of y'all out there, have anyone ever used the phrase, "Oh, my sweet summer child," to somebody else as like a bless your heart or something like that, a way to like gently talk down to someone? Has anyone ever said that to someone or had it said to you? That's your question.
Never said to me. I'm no sweet summer child. I'm a sour winter child. Bitter. I should have said bitter winter child.
Bitter, yeah.
There we go. That's me.
George
bitter
R. Martin.
winter adult, sweet summer child. There we go.
That's
perfect.
good.
Okay, that's better.
George R. Martin wrote a story called Bitter Blooms that has blue roses and an endless winter in it in a sci-fi setting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Webb Jerome. I'm sorry.
That makes me think nuclear winter child.
Yeah, nuclear winter child. Yeah. Webb Jerome from Facebook wonders if the "I know a story about a crow" line that he refuses to hear would have been about Bloodraven, meaning he refused to hear that story. I wonder if that's the crow she was referring to. She would have been aware of him. He may have even been to Winterfell because he was Lord Commander, and the Lord Commanders sometimes do business with the Starks, and maybe he just came to visit. Many people took note of how Hodor placed Bran in the high seat of the Starks. Yeah, that's very telling, and we're going to see him there again when Robb goes south, as Bran is the heir and sits as the Prince of Winterfell. Tree Girl on Flick points out that Bran is the one with the presence of mind to call off the wolves, not Robb, and he is the one comforting Robb later in the darkness when they're hanging out in bed later, which sounds kind of funny, but it's not. But it's not Robb comforting him. I mean, Robb is sort of comforting Bran, but the gesture of holding hands and Bran notices that Robb is crying. It's still notable writing, even though Robb is the one with all this pressure on him. But Bran is the one kind of dealing with it almost in a better way. Stefan B., who is German, points out that in his German audiobook, Hodor is like a lot of German words, two words pushed together, halt and Tor, which Haltur is how they say Hodor. And halt means hold, and Tor means door. So it's almost like they made his name Hold Door.
It's awesome. That's such a cool catch. I really love that.
Yes, super cool. And I don't have an answer. He wants to know if we know anything about that, and I don't. But
no, I would be very curious if you read a Game of Thrones in another language. Tell us what Hodor's name is in your language, and I'd be curious if there are any others where it effectively means hold the door. I kind of doubt it, but maybe.
It's pretty cool. That's a good catch. That's really neat. This language stuff, there's a lot of interesting clues that may or may not be intentional, because George is definitely aware of some of these other words and how they're used.
Yeah, but sometimes he doesn't seem to be, because there's some translations where they just seem like bad, obviously.
Yeah, definitely.
For the, Eagly the Eagle, like that sort of thing.
That's still one of my favorites.
I don't know, so.
That's a good one. So also Christina Manoli points out that going with our other discussions, I thought the description of Summer was interesting. He was silver and smoke, which she points out how similar that is to gray mist, which is our sign that Bloodraven is watching.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's Bloodraven or at least just
he led the direwolves to them, maybe,
more like I consider it to maybe extend to the idea of a green seer, of someone in the weirwood tree. Like I could see it maybe happening if Bran was watching someone. Yeah, is my point.
She also points out the line that Bran thinks of Summer as having with eyes of yellow gold that saw all there was to see, which is that's thinking about the weirwood network and seeing everything through the trees, and Bloodraven
and Bran himself.
Yeah, it fits along that. Yeah, that's really neat. Nina Friel says, I don't understand why Old Nan would be described as a young girl if she was brought to Winterfell as a wet nurse. Amy Lantrop says Nan could have had her first kid young and been a 15-year-old wet nurse. That is possible. Yeah, I guess maybe might just be lack of knowledge by the POV character, just assuming young girl. Maybe it just might be a loose language there.
Yeah.
But it's a good thing good catch there, regardless.
Nina also shared clarification, additional information on ages. Yeah, on ages. For example, Walder Frey is 90 by the end of A Game of Thrones, and he's 91 at a certain point. Let's see. By the end of where we are in the books, 92 years old.
Okay.
So, but there's Eric Ironmaker, who's 88. And Old Nan is, of course, not quite known.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we don't actually know how old she is. So we have the ages of some of these other characters, but Old Nan's age is not known. That's more common for commoners.
Alder Frey is the oldest person we know.
Yeah.
And Eric Ironmaker would be next.
Right on. Of people who aren't aided by magic, I assume.
Yeah.
Is the caveat there.
So you're not counting people like potentially Ghost of a High Heart,
right,
Melisandre, Bloodraven.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anyways.
And we know, and Aemon was 102 when he died. Is that right?
I think that is what it was.
So he would be 100 around here, I think, if I remember. I'm pretty sure he was born in 198. I think I remember that specifically. Anyway, someone can look that up. Let's move on to Eddard 5, the one with Pycelle and the Ponderous Tome and all that. Ned speaks to Pycelle about Jon Arryn's death. Hears the phrase, "The seed is strong." Talks to Arya about Bran's future and her own.
I'm sorry for that. This is why I shouldn't get distracted with the chat.
Well, chat is fun and distracting. I can't blame you.
Lord Arryn's death was a great sadness for all of us, my lord, Grand Maester Pycelle said.
Yeah, and so begins Pycelle's just tiresome ramblings. But within these tiresome, like, over-the-top kind of, I'm so open and honest, there's a lot to be learned, a lot to glean, and a lot to see about him, especially if we compare it to what we know about him later, meaning how he deals with Tyrion, which is a lot different. He's a lot more clever and combative with Tyrion, where he's just very deferential to Ned. But we know in both cases he's not being entirely forthright, even though here in this chapter he seems extremely forthright. In fact, Nina makes the pun that he reads like an open book. Pun intended, given the Book of Lineages. Good one.
Next quote here.
Yeah.
To be sure, King Maekar's summer was hotter than this one, and near as long. There were fools, even in the Citadel, who took that to mean that the great summer had come at last, the summer that never ends. But in the 7th year, it broke suddenly, and we had a short autumn and a terrible long winter.
This is similar to warnings we're seeing elsewhere in these early chapters. Jeor Mormont's one who makes it, and in fact, Bran's first chapter, when they're introducing his age, it says he's 9 and it's the 7th year of winter. And it's like, whoa, summer rather. 7th year of summer, in a first chapter. You're like, what the heck is that all about? And Ned doesn't take much note of any of this because it's the words of his house. He doesn't need to be told winter is coming. I like that King Maekar is mentioned here just after these connections we discussed with Duncan the Tall. Maekar was father to Egg and the one who gave permission for Egg to become Sir Duncan's squire. Egg, a.k.a. Aegon V, gets name-dropped not long after. Also named here is Grand Maester Ethelmuir, noted back in Tyrion's first chapter. Ned also thinks of Old Nan himself. We were just talking about how people think of Old Nan all the time, and here it is happening right away. And he thinks of how she's the one who taught him the proverb, dark wings, dark words. As Pycelle rambles, being largely unhelpful to Ned, but pretty helpful to the reader, if we're kind of parsing that here. He's extremely polite, and he's like as obsequious as Varys almost, but in a different way.
You picture if you're watching TV or a movie and this were happening, it would just be this exposition info dump that would be very helpful.
Yeah.
But you would be like, yeah, already. That was clunky.
Pycelle's words are like the milk Ned is served. Too sweet and not satisfying. He tells Ned he sent Maester Coleman away to help Jon because, Maester Coleman's a young guy. He doesn't understand the frailties of older men like I do because I'm an old man. But later he actually flat out admits to Tyrion that he didn't want Coleman to succeed. He wanted Jon Arryn to die. He didn't want Coleman to save his life. But this is interesting because Pycelle isn't ordered to do this. As far as we know, no one ever told him to do this. Cersei didn't say, hey, tell these lies. Tywin certainly didn't. He's just helping the Lannisters because that's just what he does. He's a Lannister loyalist. He's kind of a fanboy. That's why people call him a fanboy because of the Lannisters, because it's not like they're not doing a lot for him. He's just kind of giving his loyalty because he thinks he likes Tywin. I think it's mostly because he likes Tywin and Tywin's
He's going to change his name to Tycelle.
Good one. Got me. That was not in the script. Pycelle ponderously names all the kings he's served to reach the conclusion that Jon Arryn's sickness was nothing special, even though the description he gives sounds suspicious. He himself says it's sudden. And Pycelle, but he says, I have all this experience, and his sickness was no different than so many others, even though the description is like, that doesn't sound normal at all. And we know Jon was poisoned, so we know he's lying or at least obfuscating. And even Robert, who, doesn't have the medical training Pycelle has, gives a different take back in Eddard 1.
Robert shook his head. I have never seen a man sicken so quickly.
Yeah. Pycelle tells Ned Jon had been burdened for a while, melancholy and tired, kind of sell the line that he was distracted, that lots of things were going on in his life, which is somewhat true. But then Robert, in that same scene with Ned, said this.
We gave a tourney on my son's name day. If you had seen Jon then, you would have sworn he would live forever. A fortnight later, he was dead.
So it's tough to see the truth because Pycelle is not honest, but Robert tends to be oblivious. So you can't necessarily take Robert's takes as gospel either. He may not have noticed. He may have just not have seen some of these things that were happening. But we do know for sure Pycelle was on the trail of Cersei and Jaime's incest. And that's certainly the secret he seems to be wanting to protect, even though, like I said, there's no indication Cersei and Jaime or Tywin or anyone, well, of course Tywin is kind of in the dark on that one too, asked him or told him to keep that secret. So, yeah. He doesn't want Ned to find out. So, next up we have Ned encountering Arya as he's walking back to his rooms, and they talk about Bran, and he thinks about how a while back he and the girls went to the Godswood to give thanks, keeping a vigil all night long.
Yet someday he may be the lord of a great holdfast and sit on the king's council. He might raise castles like Bran the Builder or sail a ship across the sunset sea.
He says it about Bran regarding sailing a ship across the sunset sea, but Arya is the one who seems to be the likely sailor, certainly out of those two. And across the sunset sea is exactly right. That's exactly what we see in the show.
It's very interesting because obviously there's a large group of people who don't think that is where Arya's story will end.
Yeah.
There's a large group of people, I think ourselves included, they're like, I don't know. That could be real or not. We really...
It's a strange line in general, just for Ned to throw that out there.
Yeah, I mean, it makes some sense to me because there are multiple Brandons who do those things.
Yeah.
There's Brandon the Builder, and then there's Brandon the Shipwright.
Yeah.
So for Ned to have an association when contemplating Bran's future, he would think about those two.
That's true. Because Bran thought about those characters because he went, he was taught them because their faces are down in the crypt. So Ned would have been educated the exact same way.
Yeah. So it might have that association. Of course, when you see sail a ship across the sunset sea, you might be like, that's random.
Yeah.
But we do know about Brandon the Shipwright.
Yeah.
Who did that? Who tried to do that.
So, and again, we have Brandon the Builder mentioned here, which is cool. Twice in just a short period of time. We have in 2 chapters, and this shows just how often some of these chapters are tying together, even when they're in completely different locations, completely different subjects. George finds a way to tie these things together. And the chapter ends with something that's a theme of this chapter and several chapters around here, which is Ned being led by the nose by Littlefinger. In this case, Ned is given a lesson on how anyone could be a spy, which is useful for first-time readers. It's something that we don't really need to hear now, but there's still something of note here.
Let me just say the first 2 words here are words you never want to hear ever.
It's such a funny line.
In any context other than this. Okay. Littlefinger fingered his small pointed beard.
Yeah, Littlefinger fingered his small pointed beard.
You are slow to learn, Lord Eddard. Distrusting me was the wisest thing you've done since you climbed down off your horse.
Yeah, I think it may have been Emmett Booth and maybe others before who pointed out that Littlefinger in this scene and some other ones is almost the literal mustache twirling villain here, except it's his beard instead of his mustache.
He's the beard stroking, the beard fingering villain. I'm just picturing. We need Sean here to see how you finger a beard right.
Well, there's beards of many shapes in this one, right? Pycelle has the long, flowing beard that he's stroking when he's talking to Ned.
Whereas he's got a pointed one. So, like, I guess finger. Anyways, yes.
They're both lying in different ways. It's all about the beard tells you the type of lies. Now, Pycelle and Varys all have different reasons for lying to Ned and Littlefinger too. Neither want Ned to continue down this path that will put Stark versus Lannister. Meaning, Pycelle doesn't want that at all. Varys wants it, but he wants it later. Littlefinger is all about this chaos and right now. And even Varys wonders what the heck he's all about, but that's part of Littlefinger's game. Do chaotic, strange things that don't seem to benefit you to throw your enemies off. As a former professional poker player, I agree with that strategy. If you do things that don't, it's a really good way to throw people off. If they're constantly watching you, they're like, well, how does this fit into his scheme? It doesn't. It's specifically to throw off people who are watching. Now, we're not long from Ned finding himself thinking constantly of his old ghosts. We're almost to the point where almost everything that happens to Ned reminds him of the Tower of Joy, or the fallout from the Tower of Joy, or the things that happened just before the Tower of Joy, like arguments with Robert over killing Targaryens and things like that. But right now, he's already chasing phantoms. So he's chasing phantoms, and later he's thinking of his old ghosts. Very much a big part of Ned's arc is how much his present is living in the past, even when he's not even realizing it. All right. Couple of notes from Joe Buckley. As we touched on a little bit, he brings up this point in a different regard. There's a lot of Pycelle versus Varys vibes in this chapter. The tendrils of this stretch both backward and forward, meaning back to the sack of King's Landing when they fell on opposite sides of whether to open the gates to Tywin. Remember, Pycelle was like, don't do it. And Varys is like, do it. That's one of the few times that Pycelle was the man to listen to. And forward, where, the dance epilogue, where Varys actually kills Pycelle. So, yeah. So the Grand Maester is wary of Varys, and he does it in an awkward way. He's like, that he brings up the wrong problems with Varys. He's like, he's a eunuch, right? Ned's like, so? Everybody knows that. But the bottom line of Maester Pycelle being wary of Varys turns out to be 100% accurate. And it's not just because Varys is dangerous, but because Varys, frankly, is better at playing the Game of Thrones than Pycelle is. Pycelle is...
Wait.
I know,
you're telling me...
Big news there.
Pycelle is not as good as Varys? I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Jury's out on that one. Maybe I went too far with that one, huh?
Yeah,
So we sometimes like to hold Ned up as a figure to be, criticized, and also as one to be upheld as a noble figure, as someone who is a step ahead of so many other parents, if not several steps ahead of so many other parents in Westeros. And you sometimes you think, you kind of roll your eyes at how he just doesn't seem to get Arya, but he's still a good dad despite that. And you compare him to other people, he looks amazing. Like, for example, would Tywin have ever sat down with Cersei to explain that her brother Jaime could have a sword but not her, the way that Ned just did? I don't think so. And we know that this happened. Cersei, in her POV, is like, I should have had the sword. She constantly resents.
She did get Jaime's sword, though.
That's true. Good point. It's in her. It's sheathed and unsheathed. Sheathed and unsheathed.
Yes, thank you, Aziz. We got the joke.
You got the joke. You did not have to go farther. Why add all that graphicness there, Aziz? Talk about over the top. Over-sweetened milk. All right, some Q&A for Eddard 5. Kiara on Patreon points out this quote from when Ned is remembering the vigil where he and his daughters spent the night in the Godswood giving thanks for Bran waking up. And the quote is, when the dawn broke over the city, the dark red blooms of dragon's breath surrounded the girls where they lay, which is one of many possible or definite foreshadowing for King's Landing burning in later. Of course, we've got this one. We've got the one in Dany's chapter, or two of them at least, and several others that I'm forgetting at the moment. A really good catch by Nina with regards to things that John Aaron was doing that show his interest in genetics. Of all the things listed off is this quote The Lord had taken a great interest in the breeding of hunting hounds. See, that quote went right by me every single time I read it. But Nina's point here is that he was breeding hounds to see like how they pass traits on to the puppies, to kind of get more evidence for what's happening with Robert's bastards. So that's a really good catch. I like that a lot.
I wonder what he did with all the hounds.
Yeah, where are those hounds now? Where are these black of hair, blue of eye hounds? Abram Gabeyu says there is George's beard stroking as well. Maybe it's an instrument. That's true. George does stroke his beard in real life.
He does it all the time.
That is a good point. I did not think of that. Good catch from Abram there. Minge Forever says, I was late, so sorry for a throwback, but the way all Brandons merge in Old Nan's mind reminds me of the stories of the Age of Heroes with lords ruling for hundreds of years, i.e. having same named heirs. Okay, yeah, so that is a question relevant to Bran 4, not Eddard 5, but still, that's a good point. We talk about how the Age of Heroes, and if not just the Age of Heroes, but stories from the Far East, like the Pearl Emperor and the different Gemstone Emperors, basically, that whole concept of they rule for hundreds of years. That doesn't make sense. But if you think of those as dynasties or as ruling houses that are merged into one over thousands of years in the telling of those stories, that's a thing that really happens in the real world.
Yeah, name after name. Uhtred, son of Uhtred, son of Uhtred, son of Uhtred.
Son of Uhtred, yes.
Anyways,
which is a real character. Not, yes, that's the Last Kingdom, but it's based off of a real series of Uhtred's of Bamberg Castle. And Bebbanburg was the original name. Yep, all real, folks. Let's move to John 4. The gang meets Sam.
John was showing Daeron how best to deliver a side stroke when the new recruit entered the practice yard.
The sword strokes, yeah.
Or a straight voice.
Man, the sexual euphemisms in this episode are off the charts. So John and the other new recruits meet Sam and protect him from Alliser and the brothers who want to hurt him. John tells Sam about his Winterfell dreams, and Ghost is, again, a very good boy. This section's called a thorny issue, and yes, that is a pun intended because we're talking about Alliser Thorne. Lots of leadership lessons in this one. John is quickly becoming a lot more likable to the reader and to the other recruits. By the end of this chapter, those things are even more true. Many of the other boys are following his lead now. That's really important. He's turned the tables on the bullies because of it, because other boys are following him and he can use numbers against them. We see him doing various jobs, many of them for people he'll later command, like Bowen Marsh and Alliser Thorne. And for those he doesn't later command, like Donald Noy, it's because they die before he becomes Lord Commander. Specifically, in terms of leadership traits here, Alliser thinks he can beat the weakness out of Sam, which is kind of how he handles most leadership questions, just with brutality or just hammering people. But he didn't put much thought into this. Sir Alliser is of House Thorne, who fought on the same side of Robert's rebellion as House Tarly, the losing side. Lord Tarly is rather famous, known to be an excellent soldier, the wielder of Heartsbane, etc. Surely Alliser Thorne has heard of him, and surely his son Samwell has experienced harsh training before. Alliser doesn't think of that, of course, nor does he take much note that a man with Sam's disposition took the black by quote-unquote choice. If he had thought about it, he'd think, well, yeah, surely this has been tried. Surely famous martial, brutal soldier Randall Tarly fought to talk sternly and toughly to his son. This isn't, you're not breaking new ground here, Alliser. And John wonders about a lot of this, and it's explained to us as he's thinking it through. John and Sam have a lot in common. More than you might think. John's bravery and Sam's cowardice are sort of a opposites attract kind of situation, a protector and a person who needs protecting. But later we see that Sam actually has a lot to offer of his own. He's not just a guy who needs protecting. But without that, it's hard for those parts of his personality to emerge. These complementary skills and differing personalities mask how much they have in common, though. They both lived in a household where the head of that household, one of the head, were divided on them. Sam's household was as if Kat and Ned were reversed, minus the secret identity part.
Robb and Bran and Rickon were his father's sons, and he loved them still. Yet John knew that he had never truly been one of them. Catelyn Stark had seen to that.
Now, Sam had been one of them in terms of one of his family, but he was never part of the so-called man's world of all that. His father tried to make that happen. It didn't click. He went on. He would rather go off and sing and hang out with his sisters instead. And of course, so to be clear, I'm not comparing that directly to what happened to Jon. Sam's treatment's far, far worse, but that's in part because of the reversal of the gender roles here. Sam's mother was on his side, which is not as much protection than Ned can give to Jon. Cat is no Randall Tarley, again, but the scene Sam describes with his father skinning the deer, right? That's the scene they gave Tywin in the show to Jaime. The dialogue is pretty different, but there's still this kind of like a really overbearing father showing you why this character is the way they are. Jon and Sam are both heirs, denied those claims, and sent to the wall. Now, Jon, of course, didn't know he was an heir, but they still have that in common from our point of view. They're the same age, born in 283, and Horn Hill is one of the closest castles to the Tower of Joy, as far as geographical locations. Not that I think that's specifically relevant, it's just kind of a neat little detail. I don't think Horn Hill or House Tarley has anything to do with the Tower of Joy mystery. Let me be clear on that. But just it's neat to note that they were born pretty close to each other in both time and location. So there's very cool stuff there. There may even be other connections between Jon and Sam that I missed. Y'all can fill in those gaps for me if you are so inclined. Let's talk about some other stuff that's going on in Jon's early arc here.
That afternoon, the watch commander sent him to the winch cage with 4 barrels of fresh crushed stone to scatter gravel over the icy footpaths atop the wall. It was lonely and boring work, even with Ghost along for company, but Jon found he did not mind. On a clear day, you could see half the world from atop the wall, and the air was always cold and bracing.
So that line, it was lonely and boring work, even with Ghost along for company, but Jon found he did not mind. That casts my mind directly to the end of his arc that we saw in the show. Him going off to just be alone, be away from the troubles of the world, not minding being lonely, especially if he has Ghost with him. That's how his story ends. So, this all, by the way, is a stark, yes, pun intended, contrast to how cold he felt before. His first chapter of The Wall, he's talking about how cold it was all the time. But now he's not only getting more comfortable with being alone, he's finding he likes it. The cold is hardly mentioned anymore. This may even foreshadow, all that simple life stuff at the end. Speaking of Jon growing up and changing, there's this other line of note here.
Jon cherished the rare afternoons when he was sent out with Ghost ranging at his side to bring back game for the Lord Commander's table.
I wonder if there's any dragony stuff. I'm not dragony stuff, but skin changing manifesting just a little bit, going out ranging with Ghost, hunting with Ghost. That's when that stuff might be most prominent, when Ghost is using all his senses and they're really trying to be aware of what's happening around in the woods. Yeah, feels like that could be something. But there's more, of course, some more foreshadowing and clues here.
The old bear had sent out rangers in search of him.
This is Benjen we're referring to.
Sir Jeremy Riker had led 2 sweeps, and Corrin Halfhand had gone forth from the Shadow Tower, but they'd found nothing aside from a few blazes in the trees that his uncle had left to mark his way. In the stony highlands to the northwest, the mark stopped abruptly, and all trace of Ben Stark vanished.
That's definitely a detail I forgot, that we had sort of a directional indication to what part of the country he vanished into, the stony highlands to the northwest. Totally forgot about that. I remembered that he had left marks and that they had suddenly vanished, that the trail vanishes. So, yeah, little clues there. And, of course, the rangers who come back as whites, some of them that were in his party, those are well out of sight for now as well. Think about that. Whoever disappeared with Ben, there's no sign of them either until they show up when Jon is giving his vows. So that's very suspicious because, those bodies weren't found until they were deposited really close to the wall. Regarding Jon being king, his dream amongst the Stone Kings is a clear hint. This bit here may be the crux of it.
I scream that I'm not a Stark, that this isn't my place, but it's no good. I have to go anyway. So I start down, feeling the walls as I descend with no torch to light the way, It gets darker and darker until I want to scream.
Yeah, the crown of the North would be his because he's a Stark, but he's not, even if Robb names him the heir. So that's kind of what the dream is telling us there. I have to go anyway because, well, if he's named king in the North and everyone thinks he's a Stark, that's kind of what that means. I have to go anyway, even though I'm not a Stark. This isn't my place. And because of course he's actually a Targaryen if what we think we know is accurate. So yeah, the Crypts of Winterfell aren't the place for Targaryen to rest.
It just bothers me still. I'm like, he is a Stark.
Yeah, he has the blood.
He is half Stark, and he grew up there. Like he is big. He betrays so many more Stark traits than he does a Targaryen.
Absolutely.
So like that's where like I don't disagree with that interpretation, but it still bothers me that it would ultimately be the case. Maybe in the books they will show him embracing some more of his Targness, and it'll make more sense to me.
Yeah, maybe once he gets a dragon, and so I still think he'll end up.
Once he actually bonds with a dragon instead of just riding a dragon.
But I do think he ends up embracing his Stark heritage. That's the nurture. That's what how he was raised and all that. I think that's. Yeah, I think we all agree on that. But you're right. It feels a little off, but because he is just as much Stark as Targaryen, it's the rules of men's names come first. That's the only difference here. It's not like that. It's not like that law means his genetics make him more Targaryen. He's still half and half. And of course, this is so well hidden because Jon isn't thinking about, I'm actually a Targaryen. No, he's thinking that he's a Snow. That's obviously what's going on in his head. So it's a wonderful mess of different meanings here. And it's also ties into if the show is accurate, how he's going to feel about being king, not just of the North, but king on the Iron Throne. He doesn't want it. He doesn't want it at all. This is exactly what he's dreaming. I have to go anyway. Feeling the walls that ascend. I don't want it. This isn't my place. Ghost is again his comfort, though. And that's again a great clue, backed up by what the show reveals as Ghost being kind of his refuge, kind of his place for ending things. And this other line here as well, I want to point out, is very noteworthy. One of the ones that near the end of the chapter.
I never saw snow until last month. We were crossing the Barrowlands, me and the men my father sent to see me north, and this white stuff began to fall like a soft rain. At first, I thought it was so beautiful, like feathers drifting from the sky, but it kept on and on and on until I was frozen to the bone. The men had crusts of snow in their beards and more on their shoulders, and still it kept coming. I was afraid it would never end. Jon smiled.
Yeah, Jon smiling is the real incongruous part there, because he's just laughing at a southerner adjusting to the snow, but the idea of Sam, I was afraid it would never end, it just certainly makes us think of the long night and the snow getting way, way worse. Jon won't be smiling then. On the human side of things, like I said at the beginning, Jon's becoming a leader here. It's great to see that. It's like I said, it's like we see with Sansa and with Bran. All these characters are becoming leaders. They're learning and Dany, they're learning their leadership traits, and we're seeing them do mostly good with it. On the other hand, the way he uses fear on Rast is not, it's effective for sure. It works. Rast does not attack Sam again, but it's also not the best way to lead. It engenders hate. Someone like Rast is going to be thinking of getting revenge. Although Rast does not get revenge. Athen does for him, as they say in the books. In the show, it's Ghost, but whatever. We like the book version. Some notes from Joe Buckley here. Good stuff. He points out that Jon doesn't recognize Sam's sigil, which is a nice comparison to the differences in upbringing between him and Sansa, who recognizes like all the sigils. Even Podrick Payne in A Storm of Swords recognizes all the Dornish sigils, which is, a kind of a little nod to the type of education the Trueborns get versus the bastards.
Yeah, I assume they all get it. I wonder if there's a certain, if certain sons and daughters are more likely to, certain families have more, I don't know.
Sansa may have just wanted to learn these more, but also maybe Jon didn't. Maybe Jon was like, I don't care about all
Whereas I feel like Podrick Payne, living in the Westerlands, for him to be much familiar with the Dornish houses speaks to him really learning it. And
Yeah.
they're not a very big house. And I don't know. Anyway, it points to maybe a lot of noble children knowing a lot about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Having a chapter about being a craven that involves Darion is a little ironic. Darion's one of the ones who points out Sam's cowardice, but Darion's the one who deserts the Night's Watch in Braavos, only to have justice dealt out to him by Arya.
Yeah. Ugh, Darion.
Yeah, Darion turns out to be as bad or worse than Marillion.
Yeah, he's very infuriating, frustrating.
Yes, even though he has such a nice voice. Honey poured over thunder, but used for the wrong things. Let's do some John 4 Q&A here. Pip's skills at mummery are impressive. It reminds me a bit of Varys and the scenes in Braavos with Arya. You wonder if, kind of doubt that's ever going to matter, but I like seeing it. It just shows us that these things are possible, reminds us of how these things can be used. And I like this line here that George writes about the wall. The wall loomed before them, glimmering palely in the light of the half moon. And by like it, I mean, that's a weird phrase. Palely? Glimmering palely? That's good said right there. That is good said. well, good. Also, all this talk of brothers reminds me of a quirk. John's brothers and sisters are actually his cousins. His aunt is actually his mother. His father is actually his uncle. But his uncle is actually still his uncle. Benjen is the one familial relation he has that remains the same after everything comes forward with his real parentage. So that's kind of neat. But, of course, Benjen may not be around much for him to discuss that with.
And Brandon and Rickard. Oh.
That's true. Oh. Excellent comment by Laura Boros, Lady of Infinity. John defending Sam is reminiscent of his mom, Lyanna, standing up for Howland Reed. He's just that kind of guy. That's cool.
Yeah, also, I point out, happy birthday, Laura.
Oh, yeah, happy birthday, Laura Boros. And shout out to all of our History of Westeros Facebook mods. Definitely great discussions happening on Facebook about these chapters every week. And Laura is a big part of that. So is Nina Friel, whose comment here is also comparable to Arya, who doesn't recognize Northern sigils at Harrenhal. Arya maybe. Okay, so Arya did get that education, and she seems like someone who just wouldn't care.
Yeah, like I could see her being taught it, and maybe she wasn't taught it all because you have to be interested, but I could see her being taught it and just slacking off like she does with.
And she hasn't been taught it as many years as, as
yeah, that's also a good point.
She's younger, but still.
Yeah.
Minge Forever says, well, Payne was especially taught by Tyrion in expectancy of the visit. Was he? I thought he just knew him. Tyrion was proud of him. I don't remember
sure either.
That.
And then Nina said, wasn't Podrick specifically studying the Dornish sigils? I don't remember exactly myself, so I decided to put it in here so anyone else could chime in.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, and here's a quote from Arya that Nina grabbed as well. Whenever Septa Mordane had gone on about the history of this house and that house, she was inclined to drift and dream and wonder when the lesson would be done.
Oh!
Yeah, she never paid
There
attention.
it is. Nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I guess we will get to that.
Yet another little detail George did supply us. He did cover that base. Very nice. Very nice. Okay, let's go to Eddard 6. The gang meets Gendry. Ned deals with the tournament, the crowds, a ponderous tome. Ned, of course, hates dealing with tournaments. The tournament of Harrenhal is probably, not for a lot of reasons, but he has bad memories of the tournament of Harrenhal, as well as other things. So, it just doesn't put him in a good stage of mind. The ponderous tome, like I said. Renly is there, none of which he particularly likes any of the stuff. He doesn't really like Renly. He doesn't really like the ponderous tome, the crowds, the tournament. But he meets Tabho Mott, Master Armorer, who he does like, and Gendry, who he also likes. And I like the reason he likes Tabho Mott. This is a really human connection here. The Master Armorer finds himself in the same predicament as Ned himself, protecting a royal-blooded boy through no, he didn't set out to be this boy's guardian, just like Ned didn't set out to be Jon's guardian. And in both cases, the boy is innocent and unaware of his heritage. And in both cases, though, Tabho Mott is a much lower station than Ned. In both cases, the people that want to kill this boy are more powerful than their protector. Yeah, Ned's a high lord, hand of the king, but Robert's more powerful than he is. Robert's power structure is more powerful than Ned. And of course, Tabho Mott being just an armorer, there's plenty of people more powerful than him. And the reason that Ned likes Gendry is how much he reminds him of Robert. Gendry is about 14 years old, an age that he and Robert waxed nostalgic about very recently, and an age that Ned was somewhat happy. It was maybe the only time in his life that he had relative happiness. And of course, as I said a little while back, we're about at the stage where nearly everything starts reminding Ned of the past. He's living in the past as much as he's trying to live in the present, but he can't help be reminded of some of these things. And of course, in this case, you have, well, this boy was born not long after Robert's rebellion, so how are you not going to think of that? A little other detail, just passing through the streets to Tabho Mott's Beric Dondarrion shows up. There's a lot of this cross pollination of chapters here. Something that we lose as the narrative spreads to so many other locations. You know, we had other people take note of Beric here, and then Sansa, or rather Ned takes note of Beric here, then Sansa's going to take note of Beric later. We have Catelyn taking note of Jason Mallister on the road, only for Sansa to see Jason Mallister at the tournament. That sort of close connection isn't going to happen as much as the POV spread out, so I like to appreciate it while we can. The bastard theme comes up here in another subtle way before Ned heads to the armorer. Renly shows Ned a locket of Marjorie, kind of wanting him to confirm for her that she looks like Lyanna, but she does not. Ned doesn't think a whole lot of it, but in this we see the beginnings of Renly and the Tyrells plotting to replace Cersei with Marjorie. Again, Ned has no idea what's happening, but astute readers do. And this is strong evidence that Renly knew about Cersei's children. Given how many other people figured it out, it's not hard to see how Renly could have, especially because he didn't have to figure it out himself. He could have just been told by Olenna or any of the Tyrell agents who have been, working on all this, trying to figure it out, because they're all working together. They're all plotting together. So whatever Olenna knows is probably getting passed on to Renly. As far as the parentage issue, certainly Olenna has secrets from Renly, but this part they're probably together on.
No, maybe. We just never knew that Olenna and Renly are actually best friends, tight as thieves.
And of course, the best evidence for all here probably is that the fact that they're conspiring to replace Cersei in general. It's not like Marjorie's sons with Robert would have come before Joffrey and Tommen. So they either knew that they could set them aside because they were bastards, or they were planning to kill them, which is also possible. But I think it's probably they knew about the bastardy. It may have been both also, but I doubt it was just they planned to murder them being ignorant of the bastardy.
The thing I don't understand there is, why would they not have made a move already if they could just be like, look, Cersei is cheating on you with her brother. I have to think Robert might believe then that he might have had some weird feelings about things.
Maybe they don't want it to go to. Maybe they don't want war to break out. They think maybe that's chintzy.
Yeah,
they might lose.
Yeah, they don't want Tywin to have to do that. Yeah, that's
they don't want to. They would rather just.
Yeah.
If Tywin just if they can sneak Marjorie in there and get a divorce, that's just then they can. Then they're in a better position to replace those bastards.
Would have been to try to kill Cersei in some
way. Maybe
honestly,
that was an alternative thing they considered.
Kill Cersei and then have it revealed like I don't know. Anyways, yeah, that's a digression.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting little conundrum.
We'll have to get more into it, I guess, when we get more into the Tyrell plots.
Yeah,
later.
True that for sure. So with the bull here, it's interesting that Tabho mentions that Renly and Loras both had their armor made here just after this bit of plotting with Renly and Loras involved. So did they see Gendry there, or is it just because Tabho is just such a great armorer? Another thing that it can be both for. I also want to point out that we need to be aware that Gendry in A Song of Ice and Fire should have major differences versus the HBO version, since on TV he's a combination of Gendry and Edric Storm. But here he is his own self. Edric Storm is his own self. We also see some of the early groundwork for Valyrian steel being laid out here. We've seen ice, heard of Heartsbane and the Cat's Paw dagger, and now we have a person capable of reforging it, and indeed he does turn ice into two swords later, and maybe ice will be reforged later? Who knows? Maybe. Tabho Mott is from Qohor, which Dany just passed in her chapter earlier this episode. And, it's really interesting to think about how much Stannis is mentioned and how we didn't know much about him back then, but we know a lot about him now, and it's just thinking about how much impact a character can have by not even being there, which is hard to see when we don't know what Stannis is like. But now you think about, whoa, if Stannis was there, all these things would have been different. It's another example also of Ned not really exercising his power, being shy and kind of humble about being Hand of the King. He's just nice about it, you know, and where he could be more like Krieg and Stark. And it's interesting too that Renly calls Shireen ugly, which is kind of it's an ugly comment, and it shows a bit of what his real character is. Maybe that he's a little more show. Maybe he's a little more shallow. He's good at hiding who he really is, but maybe it's just, you know, something else. But that's his niece he's talking about. That's kind of mean.
To be fair, I think a lot of people would be pretty disturbed by Shireen.
Yeah, that's
She's
true.
She's a very
she
sweet
is,
girl, but him saying ugly is different than him being like, you know, she's scary or she freaks me out or any other thing. But like of the people to say that about, I don't know.
Yeah. It's interesting to note like how different the Baratheon brothers are and how Jon and Sam's complementary skills work, you know, kind of end up working well together, even though they're so different from each other, and how the Baratheon brothers could have been, you know, really good, but not.
It's hard to really see their styles not clashing, though.
Yeah, you're right. That's true also, because they just have so much attitude and ego with each other. There's all that. Okay, so a couple of questions here about Eddard 6. Or rather, Eddard 5. I skipped ahead here. No, this is Eddard 6. Whoops. See, that's why we need these descriptive titles. I'm already getting lost. So we on Facebook there was a discussion of how Fire and Blood gives even more backup to the Baratheon coloring. It shows up even, you know, gives it even more history and more backing of how long that's been in place. And a lot of people pointed out how they appreciate the way, even though Ned's shyness and humility about using power can be a little frustrating. A lot of people seem to love how he speaks to Jory, how, you know, he kind of treats him as almost an equal, doesn't talk down to him, and you know that someone like Tywin wouldn't do that. And on the, I know Kat is somewhat similar. She treats Sir Roderick, you know, pretty respectfully, although there's a pretty big age gap between those two. It's a different kind of cultural thing there, but still, it's something that they both have.
Nina brings up a quote to settle the thing that we were curious about. With the sigils, the heralds. The lad had been making a diligent study of Dornish heraldry at Tyrion's command, but as ever, he was nervous. I can't see. The wind is flapping them.
At Tyrion's command. Yeah. There it is. Okay, good catch by y'all there. Nice.
I'd wonder if women who host are more likely to be taught and firstborn.
Because they have to be the
lady of the house.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That makes a lot of sense. They're taught to be polite.
What
and
is
all
this?
That.
Is it from the TV? You keep having like this red flashing light on you, Aziz.
A red flashing light on me?
Yeah,
really?
It's like it looks like it's from the TV reflected.
Interesting.
It's only happened a few
times.
Looks
like I think I'm being targeted by snipers.
They must have had, Aziz has baseball on, by the way, on the TV here. Not that he can watch much,
no,
but
I
just
can't.
FYI.
I can barely squint and see it.
Anyways, that was weird.
Okay, so Catelyn 5. Let's go there. The one where she captures Tyrion. Here's the first line.
My lady, you ought cover your head, Sir Roderick told her as their horses plodded north. You will take a chill.
The inn at the Crossroads makes the first of its many appearances, and Catelyn gets a taste of what it's like to not be looked at as a lady, but it doesn't last long thanks to Merillion and Tyrion. This chapter has serious vibes linking it to Rhaegar and Lyanna, the Tourney and Harrenhal, and the Blackfire Rebellions. And yeah, I say that even though the Blackfire Rebellions were a seed in George's mind at this time. He hadn't come up with the name Blackfire, but he may have come up with the concept of Black Dragon versus Red Dragon. And I want you to be thinking about that as I describe some of this detail of the history of the house, or of the history of House Inn, as I'm calling it, Inn of the Crossroads. For a much fuller history of the Inn, check out Radio Westeros' episode named after it. 6 different POV chapters take place here throughout the series. 4 of them are in this first book, though. And I'm going to guess we're going to get at least one more before the books are done. Maybe more than one. Catelyn recalls the owner Masha Heddle, and indeed the Heddle family has owned the place since the time of a crippled knight named Sir John Heddle. Before him, the place had held a variety of different names, and at times the Trident's banks have been close to it because the Trident has moved over time. That's how rivers work. And in John Heddle's day, it came to be known as the Inn of the Clanking Dragon. That's just one of many names it's had. Before there was even a Daemon Blackfire, let alone his house or a rebellion, he hung a black iron dragon sign that made a clanking sound when it blew in the wind. Many years later, we don't know how many, but when the Blackfire Rebellion did eventually come around, Lord Derry, whose lands are nearby, who was a Targaryen, as in Red Dragon loyalist, he cut the sign down because it annoyed him because of how much it looked like the Blackfire sigil. Years later, the sign washed up on the Quiet Isle, rusted red. Now, this story is major evidence for a plotline unspoiled by the show, yay, which is the real Varys and Illyrio plot, the Young Griff plot. The Black Dragon is Daemon Blackfire. Being tossed in the water is a nod to them fleeing across the narrow sea. Young Griff's ships have just washed ashore, like the Red Dragon sign did many years later. He's got the Golden Company, and they're calling him the son of Rhaegar, meaning a Targaryen, meaning a red dragon, but beneath that rust, he's a black dragon, even if he doesn't know it himself. And the metaphor is even more amazing when you realize how nicely it fits with beneath the gold, the bitter steel, beneath the rust, the red rust, the black dragon, right? And the Golden Company has always supported black dragons, never a red one. And here they are supporting Young Griff, so they're probably supporting a black dragon, aren't they? Yeah. One of Sir John Heddle's ancestors, Black Tom Heddle, was at the center of the second Blackfire Rebellion for the Black Dragon. He appears in the Mystery Night and winds up hanged, I guess you could say. Stannis would be very, would want me to make sure I get that right. Instead of the rusted red dragon sign, we have Masha Heddle's teeth, red from sour leaf. Like Black Tom, she too winds up hanged by Tywin. And of the men who ride with Catelyn and Sir Roderick in the Vale after taking Tyrion, 3 of them are Brackens, the House of Bittersteel. None of them make it to the Vale, though. To think, at the start of the chapter, she's thinking of how Riverrun is her next destination, and instead, she goes somewhere entirely different. Before she gets to the inn, she thinks of certain of her father's bannermen, all of whom rise in prominence throughout the story. It's kind of like early world building for the houses that are going to be in the War of the Five Kings on the Riverland side. You got Blackwood, Bracken, Frey, the Mootons of Maidenpool, and of course some of these houses behave a little bit the way that they'll behave in the wars. The Freys, Catelyn tries to get the Freys to do something and they just chill. They don't help at all. They just sit there. Excuse me. And when we have Brienne's POV taking us to the Mootons of Maidenpool, we see what's going on there with Randall Tarley keeping Lord Mooton in a tower cell. And we see Castle Derry, where Lady was executed not long before. And the Wents of Harrenhal are mentioned, whose blood is in all the Stark kids because Cat's mother is Lady Minissa Went. They all have that bat blood. Earlier mention of the Quiet Isle puts me in the mind of Sandor, who, of course, is hiding there and has scenes at the end of the Crossroads later. He's feeling guilty for his many sins and how the elder brother there is, and while we're there, rather, the elder brother tells a first-hand story, because he was in war, of what it's like for commoners to be in battles and campaigns and how little they know what they're doing. And that's exactly what we see with some of these soldiers who stand up to follow Cat. Marillion, in particular, not even a soldier. They have no idea what they're getting into. Nor did most of the men in the Blackfire Rebellions or Robert's Rebellion or the War of the Five Kings. It's quite a theme, really. But the theme is even more powerful than this. This is, in the Crossroads, I mean, within the range of where Lyanna and Rhaegar ran off together, more popular told as him kidnapping her, which is a huge part of the theme here. Cat taking Tyrion, no matter the reason behind it, helped lead to war, just as Rhaegar and Lyanna's elopement also led to war. When Jorah later says the common people want to be left alone when the High Lords play their Game of Thrones, this chapter reminds me of that, in part because it shows Catelyn incognito, where she experiences the smallest, barest taste of what it's like to not be highborn, to not be recognized, to not be given smiles by the innkeeper, to not be, the daughter of the Lord Paramount of the kingdom they're all standing in. With her mother dead, Catelyn is probably the most powerful woman in the Riverlands, right? And that power has limits. George shows us that in the way that certain people don't follow her, like the Freys, but others do, like the Brackens. And neither Lord Jason Mallister nor Masha Heddle recognize her. And so they don't give her that deference that she's used to experiencing. And to her, that's enough. She's like, okay, well, they're not going to recognize us, so let's move on. All it took was for her was one High Lord not recognizing her for her to think that would be how it went for everybody. But that's not quite how it worked. I wouldn't call that a mistake on her part, but it is, an issue of perspective. Masha yells how she doesn't want any of this to happen. Don't do this. Don't fight. Don't have your High Lords quarrels in my inn. And of course, she had nothing to do with any of it, but, well, the commoners suffer when those High Lords play their Game of Thrones, and she's hanged by Tywin just because this happened in her inn, even though she had nothing to do with it. But that's nothing compared to, as badly as she suffered, it's nothing compared to what's going to happen throughout the Riverlands. And Tywin, of course, is the main reason for all that, too. A reaction from him is predictable. That the fact that Catelyn takes Tyrion, it makes sense that Tywin would do something. His reputation is pretty well known. I'm not sure it was predictable that he would go this far, that he would just torch the whole Riverlands, just go mad with it. But maybe it was predictable. I'm not entirely sure. It depends on Kat's perspective, what she knows about Tywin. His reputation is what it is, but what she knows about him personally is maybe a little different. But Masha's relatives reopened the place later as an orphanage that has ties to the Brotherhood Without Banners, a group very hostile to House Lannister and House Frey. So this story is not done. The Heddles are still in play. The lucky man here, I suppose you could say, in the short term at least, is Littlefinger. His lies are working out way better than he could have thought, probably. I mean, they really worked out amazingly. Not only did he get these major houses that he said there's throats, but Catelyn seizes Tyrion on this false information and runs to take refuge with her sister, the person who's already plotted against her because of Littlefinger. So, geez, man. And of course, the road to the Vale isn't exactly safe either. That's part of the danger she finds herself in because of this decision. Yeah, big deal. So as far as Lysa and River and family, something we pointed out before is how she kind of doesn't have a good read on her sister at this point. She is also maybe thinking about her family a lot because of how war is going to break out. She may also be thinking of warning her sister. It's not just that she wants to take Tyrion there to face justice and to avoid Tywin's response, but because of what Ned had told her, that war is not unlikely at this point, and if that's going to happen, she sort of feels a duty not only to warn Lysa, but to warn Riverrun, which was what her original intent was before she ran into Tyrion there. Let's take a few questions from Catelyn. Doesn't look like we have any questions for Cat 5, so we can skip that.
Apparently, everyone thinks this is an incredibly boring chapter. I don't know. There's very little here.
I think the undertones are really powerful, but the basics are pretty straightforward. It doesn't have a lot of, there's not a lot of, it's pretty, I guess it's just that. It's straightforward. Catelyn seizes Tyrion. There's some cleverness. There's some good writing.
Oh, wow. That really sheds light on something else later that, that I never would have gotten until retrospect.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people maybe weren't as tapped into some of this Blackfire stuff and how it ties into also the War of the Five Kings, but well, we covered that pretty thoroughly, so I guess there wouldn't necessarily be questions about that. All right, then. Well, the last chapter of this session is Sansa 2, The Gang Goes Jousting, a.k.a. The Gang Goes to a Tournament, a.k.a. The one with Sandor's origin story. Several of the characters we saw in the peripheral of other characters, in peripheral of other chapters, are engaged in a small bit of action here. A lot of them we saw scattered about, and they all kind of converge here. And it's a warm-up for real war later with a few seminal character moments. It's very notable that this chapter follows Kat's because the two are really linked thematically in so many ways. They work really well together. As Kat is seizing Tyrion is a nod to Rhaegar seizing Lyanna just after the tourney of Harrenhal. This is the tourney following a kidnapping instead of before it. So we got these really strong R plus L equals J, Jon Snow vibes going on here. Sansa is, of course, in my opinion, a perfect point of view for this tournament. Most of the house, not only do we just, from what we discussed about her being very aware of who all the houses are, but most of the houses are still fairly new to the reader. Like, you just heard a lot of these names, but at this point, the reader's like, wait, who are all these houses? And her wonder at the splendor and newness of it all, the epicness of it all, it's like a shared experience for the reader. But of course, some of it isn't entirely new. Like I said, we just saw the phrase at the end of the Crossroads, and Catelyn, like I said, passed the Malisters on the road. Ned saw Beric Dondarrion, etc.
Sansa rode to the hand's tourney with Septa Mordane and Jane Poole in a litter with curtains of yellow silk, so fine She could see right through them.
That is a wonderful analogy. Earlier scene when she rides in the wheelhouse, Arya points out that you can't see the world around you when you're in the wheelhouse because the curtains are thick. All you can see is the inside of the wheelhouse. Now we have the coverings of the wheelhouse, you can see through them. So the veil is still there. She still has a veil over her eyes, so to speak, but it's thinner. So she's starting to see the world as it is. And this speaks to what's happening in a tournament. For her, this is just this grand, glorious event. But tournaments can be pretty serious. People die, which she sees, and we see here. And so many lords and ladies in one place that's where conspiracies form. And love affairs that result in, well, you know that story, the Night of the Laughing Tree. The kind of love story isn't the one Sansa has thought much about yet, though. Sansa's thinking about the princess and princess. It's not these princess and princess eloping and causing wars and all that. That's a whole different thing. And we get to see just how extremely creepy Littlefinger is. He walks up and runs his thumb along her jawline. She's 12, man. What the heck? That is so creepy. And Septim Ordained she doesn't do anything. She just is like, oh, I'm so happy that you're here talking to us, Lord Littlefinger. It's creepy. Now, here's a quote that a lot of people pointed to that's just beautifully written and full of unspecific but maybe dark foreshadowing.
His armor was shiny new. A bright streak of fire ran down his outstretched arm as the steel caught the light. Then the sun went behind a cloud, and it was gone. His cloak was blue, the color of the sky on a clear summer's day, trimmed with a border of crescent moons. But as his blood seeped into it, the cloth darkened, and the moons turned red, one by one.
That's like blood moonish. You've got the cloth darkening, everything turning one color. You've got maybe some of that sign of that desolation. You've got the sky being blocked out.
Streak of fire.
Woo. That's powerful. And it's attached to this just completely unimportant character, Sir Hugh, who's not even as important as he seems to be. Like, this scene makes us think that Gregor killed him because he knew something. But as we find out later, it's not at all. Sir Hugh didn't really know hardly anything. And Gregor just killed him because Gregor likes killing, and he saw the opportunity to do so. So it turns out to be very little, but George makes it into something by attaching this crazy foreshadowing and this amazing writing to it. We also have this really what turns into a rare moment of humanization for Joffrey, as he seems embarrassed by his father. And like a lot of kids, he idolizes his dad. And so it's kind of sad that Robert's not a good father. Not actually his father, but still Robert didn't raise him. Robert thinks Joff is his son, and he still doesn't do a good job. So it's kind of sad. But Joff throws away. Joff doesn't get much sympathy because of his general behavior. He channels Viserys a bit when he talks about beating everyone in this tournament when he's older, which is interesting because, yeah, Joffrey he's no Viserys, but they do have some things in common, and I think we're meant to see that here. Sansa mostly forgives Joffrey, mostly blaming Cersei for the execution of Lady, which, I mean, that's fair. Joffrey didn't actually call for Lady's execution. He didn't argue against it, but blaming Cersei is fair. I mean, she was the main reason. She's the main reason Lady is dead. But Sansa also blames Arya, which is not fair. But, yeah, she's still learning. She's only 12. That the Hound's origin story is paired with all this knighthood and chivalry is... well, that's just perfect, isn't it? It's just this wonderful dichotomy. I've used the word dichotomy so many times today. But hey, it fits. I also like that...
it's the dichotomy between thinking that word is overused and loving the sound of that word.
I need a synonym, though, for real. I also like that despite how much Sandor is put off by Sansa's overly rehearsed mannerisms, she wins him over because behind that those rehearsed mannerisms, there's some realness to it, some real empathy, some real compassion. And this might be the moment that first time readers start taking her seriously. I think it's kind of a turn for her, because to me it's like one of her most admirable talents emerges here. She's afraid, but then her fear vanishes as she feels compassion. It's like her compassion for him is stronger than her terror in just the fact that he's a terrifying man. The fact that she feels bad for his trauma and his justifiable hatred of knighthood is a really powerful emotion, and it's something that I love about Sansa, and I think it's something that draws a lot of people to her as a character. And she says,
before I read this quote,
Yeah.
you said you wished you had some synonyms for dichotomy. Well, here are some options for you, Aziz.
Okay.
Division. Separation. Divorce.
Divorce.
I know. Split. Gulf. Chasm. Difference. Contrast. Disjunction. Polarity. Lack of consistency. Contradiction. Antagonism. Conflict. And then this is my favorite. Contrariety.
Contrariety.
Yes.
Whoa, that's like palely or little finger fingered.
All of those are synonyms for division or contrast between two things that are represented as being opposed or entirely different.
Okay.
So maybe some of those will sink in. I just had to take a quick sidebar to share that because I immediately Googled it.
Nice.
Contrariety.
That was way more synonyms than I would have expected.
A lot of them, I'm like,
some of them don't work that well.
No, they don't work very well. But a couple of them work.
Like inconsistency isn't. Yeah, that's not one. That's not one.
Yeah, no.
In fact, it's quite consistent. Very intentional.
Yeah. Anyways.
Well, let's move on. So Sansa says
he was no true knight.
So that's a severe understatement, but it cuts to the chase. And from a girl her age and the way she delivers it, she puts her arm on his shoulder and while she's terrified. And Sandor is probably not used to that at all. Like someone being like, "Hey, Sandor, how you feeling, buddy?" Putting his hand on her. No one walks up to him and does that, right? Like no one's even tall enough to do that. It's only because he's like kneeling down. He's surprised. He's a bit put off by it because, like I said, up to this point, he just sees her as this, oh, you're just, a pretty little bird singing the things they taught you. And he's not wrong, but she breaks out of that a little bit and it surprises him, and he doesn't admit it, but it seems like he respects her a little for it. And there's more to it on his side as well. We've learned by this chapter through Ned's memories, I believe it's Ned's memories, that there was a Clegane sister who Gregor may have killed, which if Sansa reminds him of her, then, well, he's going to feel that very deeply as well. In Bran 1, we pointed out how he listened and watched and considered leadership qualities rather than rushing to judge. He kind of gathers all the information. And this is Sansa kind of doing the same here. She's a queen with a strong sense of empathy, the exact opposite of Cersei in that regard, right? More to come when Sansa and Cersei start interacting regularly, but just, for now, I want to start that discussion to lay the groundwork. That thin veil that we referred to covering the wheelhouse, it's going to eventually become just a few threads and eventually nothing. It's not long before Sansa is seeing these Tyrell cousins and thinking about how they're these sweet summer children, almost like the way old Nan thinks. But this is also familiar writing territory for George R. R. Martin, who wrote for the TV show Beauty and the Beast before he wrote A Song of Ice and Fire, which is yet another reason to suspect that Sansa and Sandor may meet again, not necessarily romantically, but there's some evidence that their arcs will come together again, and this here quote is more evidence for that.
Yeah, this is from a few chapters ago. A direwolf is a savage beast. Sooner or later, it would have turned on your girl the same way the other did on my son. Get her a dog. She'll be happier for it.
And then Joffrey yells dog when summoning him to walk Sansa back to her apartments. And I also like that Joffrey serves her a queen's portion off of the roast joint they're eating. And speaking of queens, there's some interesting Cersei description here that is very peculiar.
The queen's face was a mask, so bloodless that it might have been sculpted from snow.
Now, contrast that line to Jon 1, the banquet at Winterfell, another time when Cersei is embarrassed by Robert. That's the same thing happening here. And in that scene, Jon thinks,
beside him, the queen seemed as cold as an ice sculpture.
So we got sculpted from snow and an ice sculpture. That's very distinct. I mean, that is... You can't get past that without wondering. Is this foreshadowing for Cersei becoming undead? Maybe George had some plans for that in the original 1903 outline. Not that it doesn't show up in there as that. So, I don't know. Or is it true foreshadowing? Perhaps she does get turned into the undead. Maybe she's a Night Queen type figure. It's entirely possible. It's hard to see how she could get to that point, but hey, George is, he's good at that sort of thing. But perhaps it's an emotional state. After her children are all dead, maybe after, let's look at how it happened on TV, just for a basic general idea. She screamed for Joffrey, wept for Myrcella, but went cold for Tommen. By the time her third kid was dead, she was just a different person. And maybe that's what we're seeing here, how she's gradually going to become emotionless because of all the pain, all this trauma of losing her children. And indeed, there's a line that speaks to that. Sansa considers her own lack of tears for Sir Hugh and how she looks down on Jane for her lack of composure. It's interesting.
She ought to be crying too, she thought, but the tears would not come. Perhaps she had used up all her tears for Lady and Bran.
She thinks that she should be crying. It's like a responsibility that she thinks she has. It's not like, normally this would make me cry. It's not like she's like realizing that she's a little more mature. She's wondering where her normal emotions are. It's different for her. This is her expectation has changed. This is like, I would normally not behave like this.
Question is, later on, do we when she finds out about Robb and Catelyn, do we have a quote where she cries? A question.
Yeah, she definitely does. It's a lot of it's through Tyrion's point of view that he sees her red eyes and that she's trying to hide it, but it's clear that she's been suffering
crying,
badly.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a thing that's really huge. It's a big part of her empathy. That's a growing point here, and I think that's like Jon in Jon's third chapter. This is Sansa's second, but Jon's third chapter. Once he starts to be a leader and starts to not be, a privileged kid, he's like, this is a great kid. And Sansa, to me, this is that same moment for her where she starts to. She's not leading a bunch of people like Jon is, but she kind of takes charge in a sense over at least part of this scene with Sandor. He's still kind of like looming over her, and the violence is implicitly possible, but she takes over like takes the emotional lead in the scene really powerfully. I love it. Also of importance are a lot of the characters she sees in the tournament. Of course, in Bran's dreams. The Hound, the Mountain, and Jaime are 3 of the 4 figures that Bran sees, and those are 3 of the final 4. The other one is Loras. And if we think of those ones, well, none of them are in good shape. Now the Mountain's undead. The Hound is, his leg is messed up, and he's, all full of guilt. Jaime lost his hand, is trapped by Stoneheart. Loras either has burns all over his body and several other injuries, and unless that's a lie, but I'm guessing it's not, but it might be. Barristan Selmy's mentioned in the tournament as well. He's about to fight in the Battle of Fire. Who knows how that's going to go for him? So I wrote a section here that I thought maybe we would cut, and I'm going to cut it, but I'm going to record it separately and put it up as a patrons only bonus content. I did a nice page or 2 on where are they now, all the people mentioned in the tournament, and where they went, and where their current status is. There's 7 Freys, there's Jason Malmster, there's some Kingsguard, there's Royces, there's Meryn Trant, there's Karens, there's Redwines, there's a bunch of characters mentioned, a bunch of Winterfell people. So I'll record that separately and release that as a bonus for y'all. Anyone who's a patron will get access to that. But since we're already past 5 o'clock, I don't want to, that's too much time for us to spend on that. So a couple more things about Sansa, and check that out later if you get the chance. Whoops, lost my place. This connects really well with the previous chapter. Cat showing off her knowledge of all these families and loyalties and sigils, and Catelyn really, shows how much she is like her mother, and has all the same knowledge and is happy to have this knowledge. We did at least get a little bit of talking about Lady. It didn't deal with it directly. She thinks about how that was in the past, but that's it's still. We showed you how it still managed to hit pretty hard, even though it was only just a one-liner, and how it ties into other things happening. The tournament, it's interesting to think about how we all have so much entertainment in our lives. We have TV, we have internet, we have so many things. This is just a huge thing. Just like Ned doesn't like it, but other counselors tell him how big a deal it is to the commoners. And that's an example of the noble detachment from the lives of commoners, something that we see with Cat's chapter. We see a little bit with Ned here and there. It's not a negative about them. It's just the way the society works. I mean, it's not a good thing either, but they were raised this way. They weren't taught to think about these things that much. They do sometimes, but it's not kind of their natural way of thinking, because it's not how nobles tend to think. You got characters like Edmure that care more about the commoners, but that's pretty rare. Bran seems to be someone like that. So hopefully that's where we're headed with that. Gregor's time in this tournament gives us a lot of bit about the links to the past, talking about Robert's Rebellion. We have the Royces reminding us about the prologue and the later moments with them, which I'll describe in the Where Are They Now piece. We also have Thoros appearing. We have we have Anguy the Archer, just a lot of interesting characters who you can see why I don't have time to go through all of them in this episode. It's kind of its own thing. But even Septim Mordane gets extra characterization here. Not necessarily good characterization, but it's all over the place. So I think it's really great. I love the scene. And like I said at the beginning, Sansa, perfect POV for this one. A lot of people pointed out that quote that I read earlier, or that Ashea read earlier about Sir Hugh's death, and how people thought of the Blood Moon working title for the prequel show that's coming out because his moons were slowly darkening. And the people were wondering, well, I had a thought. George said that, sometimes some of these ideas for TV shows and things like that came from single lines in his books. And a lot of us thought that he was referring to the World of Ice and Fire because it's world building stuff, but maybe this is one of those lines. Maybe it's possible that line is where this Blood Moon idea comes from. Again, it's a working title, and it's kind of a stretch because there's almost no way that it was thought of this early. But
I very much doubt that Blood Moon was taken from this description of a cloak.
Yeah.
I have to say that I doubt that, but that the imagery of blood moons is something that happens throughout the series.
Yes.
And so they would take it from that, not from this one particular quote. I had to give my own disclaimer because it's so ludicrous, the idea of some writer coming across this cloak and being like, yes, this is the thesis of my tale.
Another good note from Joe Buckley here is that he pointed out earlier the note of Renly and Beauty and talking about Shireen. Well, Renly fights Sandor and in this duel in the tournament, and Sandor wins pretty handily, and it's another sign of what Sandor was saying, that the knights and the oils and all the blessings and all that's just dressing. The real truth is brutal and ugly, and ugly beat shiny and popular in this one. And indeed, as we know, he's the one who eventually wins the tournament. And this is kind of a metaphor there for the ugly brutality winning out in the end, even beating the kid who's amazing and cheated a little. Even the noble kid Loras, who was amazing at this thing, he cheated against Gregor a bit. Even that wasn't enough to win. So very cool. Love this chapter. Love this batch of chapters, and I'm excited for the next set. So let's do a little outro here, talk about what's coming up next, and say adios till next time. As always, check out the Isle of Faces. That's Joe Buckley's podcast for the Scraps and Strolls edition, which is where he covers... Can
I just say you said straps?
I really?
Maybe you said scraps, but you definitely said strolls.
Strolls. Strolls.
I wish you said that. I think you said scraps and strolls. But funny. It's scraps and scrolls.
Scraps and scrolls. Yeah, the Isle of Faces
Not
podcast.
to be confused with scraps and scrolls, like the scroll.
So... yeah, there's additional discussion of all these chapters will be put on Joe's podcast. That's Isle of Faces once again. So check that out if you didn't get enough. Highly recommended. Unfortunately, next week is another off week for us. We apologize for having several off weeks.
I would say fortunately.
Fortunately.
Because we get to see a bunch of people in person.
Yeah, a lot of you guys will see in person. That's true. Yeah. That's very awesome. We'll
Unfortunately for most of you, but fortunately for a small portion in us.
And we're back on July 21st for 4 in a row without interruption. Then we'll be off for 2 weeks, and then we'll have, I don't know how many in a row without interruption, but basically April to August, late August, is kind of what we call con season. It's when there's lots of conventions. For us, that's they're work related. We go, and it's important for us to go to spread the word about the podcast and to do our job. But I thought we starting in early September, there's basically nothing until April again.
Yeah, I thought we would have 3 off in a row: the 18th, 25th, and 1st.
No.
Okay.
We're doing the 1st.
Okay.
Yeah, we talked about that before.
Okay.
So here's what we'll be doing that time. Eddard 7. The gang finishes the tourney, aka the one where Varys tells Ned the Lannisters are going to kill Robert, aka the one with the breastplate stretcher. Tyrion 4. The gang fights Vale Clansmen. Arya 3, the one where Arya hunts cats and overhears Varys and Illyrio. Eddard 8, the gang argues over killing Dany, a.k.a. the one where Ned quits being Hand. Catelyn 6, the gang goes up the mountain, a.k.a. the one where they ride mules at night. Eddard 9. Yes, we'll have 3 Neddy chapters next time. This is the one where he faces Jaime in the street, aka the one where Ned breaks his leg. And these last 2, second and third of the Ned chapters, are where it really starts to be just constant. Everything that happens reminds Ned of the Tower of Joy. Note how many people are fighting in the street. Note how many people die afterwards. Note the language used. Note him cradling Jory like he cradled Lyanna. Note how Robert actually says... well, no, that's a chapter later. Robert will eventually say something just like the Tower of Joy, but that's Eddard 10, I believe. Anyway, also, last but not least, Daenerys 4, which is the gang arrives and invades Dothraki, a.k.a. the one where Dany smashes Viserys in his stupid face. So, we'll see you all at the beginning of, rather July 21st for this batch. And until then... Valar Rereadis, and let me say some thanks. Thanks to all the patrons who make this possible. As you guys know, we don't do patron shoutouts in these episodes because they are too long, but patron shoutouts do occur in our monthly live streams.
And because they're geared towards our patrons.
They are, yeah. And we will be reading those as well in the scripted episodes coming up. Thanks to Ashea, who is the best for all the great multi-armed work back there.
Not such great multi-armed work today, I must say. All these quotes keep tripping me up because I'll be trying to look at the document versus I'll be trying to look at the chat versus managing OBS, which involves moving the chapter slides.
Yep,
and
there's lots to do.
It's just, yeah.
You do a great job.
It's a new thing to
yeah,
balance.
there's some adjustment doing here, yeah.
There's some adjustment doing.
Some adjustment doing. Good said. And of course, thanks to Sir Buckley for adding lots of thoughts to this episode, as well as to his own pod. Like I said, check out Scraps and Scrolls on the Isle of Faces podcast. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld for the maps, video intro, and all that goodness that he is so well known for. And thanks to Kevin MacLeod for the music associated with our Valar Rereadis episodes. And that's it, everybody. Valar Rereadis. See you next time.